Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. As the Director of Strategy for Resilience First, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session today, organised by Resilience First in conjunction with Russell-Cooke and Facebook. Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Please do visit our website, resilience1st.co.uk, to see the many projects and events we organise in an effort to help your understanding and the application of resilience. We have recently formed a strategic partnership with the Resilience Shift organisation, so both our reach and output have expanded, we hope, for the greater good. Today's webinar is topical as we re-emerge from the ravages of the pandemic. The focus is on SMEs and the ways they can recover and adapt for the future. In many ways, SMEs are more flexible and adaptable than larger organisations to cope with changes. But at the same time, tight cash flows and labour constraints are important factors that hinder the realisation of opportunities. To help SMEs build their resilience and not just bounce back, but bounce forward, Resilience First has worked with Russell-Cooke and Facebook to design a guide to re-emergence. The guide is an adaptation of an earlier work produced by Facebook for its North American market, and we are privileged to be allowed to redraft the contents for a UK audience. Regrettably, the spokesperson for Facebook can't be with us today, but I'd like to record here our appreciation for that company's help in our endeavours. Our guide has been greatly helped by inputs from Russell-Cooke, which has given its professional advice on the text and provided a series of vignettes that bring to life the eight pillars we think can help build resilience. You will all receive a copy of the guide after this event, as well as a short summary of the proceedings. I'll shortly invite Bob Rothenberg, formerly a partner at Blick Rothenberg, the accountancy firm, to provide an overview of our guide and to chair this afternoon's proceedings. As Bob is also a member of Resilience First Advisory Board, he is well placed to lead our discussions today. Bob will introduce our three speakers who will offer their perspectives on this building small business resilience. Two of the speakers from Russell-Cooke will provide an insight on the guide based on their inputs, while the speaker from the Federation of Small Businesses will set the scene for us. Throughout the session, I encourage all of you listening to ask questions of the speakers by posting brief questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. And I'm sure the chair will pick up as many as he can as we turn to the Q&A sessions, but please do keep them brief as he's reading a scrolling screen of your questions, I hope. Lastly, I should add that the proceedings are being recorded and we will share an edited summary and any other aspects, information used in the session in the next few days. So without further ado, Bob, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Robert, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone, or where appropriate, good morning. I think it's interesting that the guide has a theme of re-emergence, because actually building small business resilience, which I think is the principal theme through it, is as important and has always been important for everybody, whether it's the society at large, communities, businesses, irrespective of size, and indeed any organisation. As the introduction to the guide says, the path towards reopening businesses may seem daunting, particularly if you're a small business and not faced crisis before. I don't want to go into the definition of small business, because I think much of actually what applies within the guide, as I think some of the audience today shows, resilience is as important to all businesses, as I've said. But for a small business, it might be seen as the first step, if you like, on a journey to building business resilience, which perhaps they haven't thought about before. and to use that expression, which has political overtones, and indeed, as Robert said, to build back better. But I like the idea of building forward, as Robert mentioned. The guide shares some practical strategies and considerations around business recovery and resilience that I think most people will find helpful. Now, times of change are opportunities to evolve and optimize capabilities, to create more effective operating models, develop a strong culture of trust and transparency, engage with all stakeholders, and prepare for the next challenge, including any further disruption, however it may be caused. Now, that sounds rather grand in saying that, but I think what the guide does successfully is to break it down. And the guide, which is based on Facebook's Global Resilience, with assistance from industry experts in various areas, crisis management, business continuity, emergency preparedness, and straightforward business recovery, has enabled the guide really to be easily adapted for the UK. And indeed, much of it applies wherever one's based. Now, the guide contains sort of key priority questions so that businesses can think about how to approach the process that they want to go through. And I think in doing this, it's also keen, I'm also keen that people are sure not to lose sight of the need to be running your business at the same time as looking at the resilience and building a plan. So, as Robert says, the guide looks at building resilience for business with the use of what are described as 8 pillars. I call them alliterative pillars on the basis they all start with the letter P. And I would like to sort of try and say that whilst the guide may appear to be a little bit formulaic, actually what it's doing is trying to focus the mind on the particular areas. So what are these 8 pillars? Prepare, and that's committing time, resource, and ownership to go through the stages in the guide to openly and honestly review one's business preparedness and to be able to respond to whatever happens in the best way. People, keeping the workforce supported and engaged. After all, your people, our people, are the most critical and valuable supporters of any business. Process. This is constantly changing, and one needs to adjust to the changing demands of business operations. Identify what needs to be adjusted to help the business thrive. Patrons, customers, stay connected to them by keeping them informed and engaged. Reflect on customer feedback and add to new customer behaviors. Profits, and this perhaps as an accountant, some people may think I think it's the most important. It is important, but everything else is contributing to the success in profits. Look at cash flow, adjust business plans, and so on, as needed. Place, where you're located, where the business does business, what are the vulnerabilities associated with that? Promotion, marketing, again, look at that in relation to moving forward. And it applies to many, many aspects. I always think that a static business is actually going backwards. And finally, practice. Make reviewing resilience a business as usual activity. Review it regularly. Feedback what has happened and change as necessary. And the way that the guide tells you to go about doing this is really through using what's called SMART goal setting. SMART being specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timeliness. And all of those, again, bring out what I see as important, perhaps because of my professional training, in looking at being able to define and measure what you're trying to do so that you can review it and see whether it is actually what one wants to do and know that you've done it in the appropriate time scale. Now, that's a very brief introduction to the guide. And I would now like to hand over, if I may, to Matt Jaffa of the Federation of Small Business, who's going to say a few more words on it. So, Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thanks very much to the team at Resilience First for allowing me to speak here today. for those who don't know, so I work for the Federation of Small Businesses, and resilience is very much in our DNA as a right of membership. We give things such as free legal advice, tax investigation protection, if you have a cyber attack, if you need insurance support, all these different facets of running a small business are there as a help for you. So it's kind of a very important topic area for us anyway. But I just wanted to talk very briefly about the notion of resilience from the small business perspective and what has been an awful time for a lot of businesses. And I was actually, earlier on today, I asked my youngest son, who's off, unfortunately he's got COVID, he's got a cold, he's absolutely fine, but he's at home, and I was just thinking of ideas in terms of what can I open up in terms of what resilience means. I just couldn't think of the actual point. So I just said, Rafi, what do you make of the word? What do you, when I say the word resilience, just asking a 10-year-old? And he just looked at me straight away and said, you keep on going when things are bad. And that was just, I said, perfect. I'll say that, perfect, because that epitomizes for a small business, a micro business with less than 10 staff. That's exactly what it means in terms of resilience. You just keep on going. It's very much like an individual being a small business. It's being resilient is just having to adapt and deal at the time. But for our perspective of small businesses, moving away into a more recovery area, back to growth, we need to be thinking about moving from keep on going when things are bad to actually taking stock when things are going well. And so that's the point we're trying to get across, and the guide is so helpful in that regard. So it's very important and pertinent time to have this out. But if you think about the state of current small businesses, confidence is not at all-time record highs. Employment is a concern. There's lots of different factors that are, impinging on the ability of a small business to return to growth. You've got, changes in terms of rent, your commercial rent moratorium ending. You've got rates coming back in. There's difficulties paying back bills. You've got huge loans you're having to pay back, whether it be C-bills or whether it be bounce back loans. And also, employment aspects in terms of the furlough coming to an end, which is going to have connotations, but also the announcement made last week by the Prime Minister in terms of national insurance contributions, that it's going to go up by 1.25%. And this could, create a lot of unemployment for a lot of businesses. And these are all playing a big part in the ability of small businesses to function on a day-to-day basis. And they will say to us, whilst resilience is great, we just want to be able to deal with the situation we've got right in front of our faces. And then hopefully when we come through that, then we can deal with a resilience strategy. But for us, it's a case that, and particularly the FSB, resilience has to be a form of what's going on, even if you are in that difficult process, because your hope is you're going to build to a position where you are going to come out of it as a sustainable business, a going concern, and you're looking to the future. So whilst in terms of the kind of the buzzwords you'll hear, very difficult for a small business to think of things like formal crisis management or sustainability or a race to net zero. These don't resonate so much with a small business as when you put right in front of them the carrots that you can, attract by having a resilience process in place. Having that process in place so that if you are susceptible to a cyber attack, you can have your business back up and running really, within the hour or a few hours, rather than days, losing days in the business, losing thousands of pounds that you'll think afterwards, why didn't I just think of that or speak to that expert to help me get through that awful time? FSB has got a sustainability hub that we've released, which helps more small businesses look to move to a net zero environment. And that's, for many businesses, will think, well, I do all I can, but what will net zero bring to my business right now, in terms of, attracting people to thinking more sustainably, excuse me, tongue twister. But it's critical for their bottom line, and it will bring lasting benefits to their business, but it's trying to ascertain to them what those benefits will be from a resilience perspective of what, if you put these measures in place long term, this will happen and this will create this opportunity moving forward, and you'll see greater growth down the line. But we mustn't get too fixated on the kind of the management speak, because that's the hardest part of the process, is to get small businesses to think about those things when you're just beating them with the stick of, this is needed or this is necessary or this is being impinged by government. We need to find ways to attract small businesses to the agenda of sustainability. And the guide has got lots of different areas there, which will be very supportive for small businesses. So I just wanted to say those few words. I'm very grateful for being on the panel. Look forward to taking questions, and just wanted to thank Resilience First once again, because I think it's a really important topic area and one that we need to have these discussions if we're not just going to concentrate on the word SME, but micro and small businesses, which are the fundamental businesses, the heartbeat of the economy, that we have to get on board with this particular agenda. And I'll pass back to Bob.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. And without further discussion, can I now hand over to Kizzy Augustin from Russell-Cooke. So Kizzy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. Well, I'll try and follow on from Matt and say that from a legal and regulatory perspective, resilience and risk is certainly a big part of the advice that I specialise in. I tend to specialise in advising small, medium-sized and large businesses in relation to risk and regulatory issues, and how either to avoid difficulties or to mitigate in respect of failures to comply with legislation and other issues. Something as big as the COVID-19 pandemic really had a major issue, an impact on small and large businesses. And despite some of the legal, the practical, logistic and other issues that came out of it, I think most employers, owners and managers and employees don't anticipate any kind of re-emergence or return to their working environment in a traditional fashion at all. That may be a good thing, or maybe just very difficult to comprehend, but we're getting through it. And something like the Resilience First Guide is probably a great first step in helping businesses build back recovery, resilience, particularly in light of disasters like the latest pandemic. So what I did, and the part that I played as part of my contribution to the guide, was actually to split into a few pillars, some of the things that I think are really important, particularly from a health and safety and regulatory perspective. So I focused very much on people and patrons, which is all about keeping the workforce engaged. For me, I tended to rely on the old adage from the construction sector, which is about communication, collaboration and consultation. I think it does apply across different sectors. Providing what your customers want, but making sure that you provide that safely and suitably. Process as a separate pillar, and that's adjusting to the demands of your business. For me, that's having the right policies and procedures in place. When we focus on the place involved, being aware of the risks to your business, which could stem predominantly from its physical environment. To me, from a health and safety background, that's making sure your workplace and your workforce is safe and secure. And practice is strengthening your competitive edge by way of monitoring, evaluating and implementing the right procedures. To me, that's all about risk assessment. None of these are new concepts, certainly to us in the legal profession and more predominantly in the health and safety sector. But if I can just elaborate on a couple of those a bit more so you can understand why we're finding some of these pillars quite important. People, all of that stems from your existing legal obligations. As an employer, as an owner of a business, you have obligations to look after the health, safety and welfare of employees and the health and safety of non-employees. That could include lots of people, contractors, members of the public, volunteers, you name it, you probably owe a duty to them. But it's this idea that you have to protect their health and safety and those people who might be affected by your business. That should be of prime importance. The way in which you demonstrate that is by having the right procedures and policies in place, and it all has to be caveated by this idea of reasonable practicability. You're doing what's reasonable in the circumstances to ensure that you are mitigating or avoiding risk. But we don't only think of people in that respect. What duties do we owe to them? We also have to think about what duties do employees owe to the business, because they also have an obligation to look after their own health and safety and that of others who are affected by their work, and do what they can to ensure that the business is complying with its legal obligations. The way in which you do that is to make sure that there is continuous and regular engagement. Engagement and communication between employers and employees is probably the best way to manage developing risks associated with any new working practices, particularly if there is going to be this huge resurgence back to your working environment. I think employees need to be empowered to raise concerns and queries in relation to the workplace, and also feel part of the decision-making process. That's the way in which you're going to get them on board with any new procedures that you'd like to put in place. Create a positive, proactive safety culture, making sure those issues are discussed at board level, making sure that that safety and security is led from the top. Processes and practice, that to me is risk assess, risk assess, risk assess. Again, there are legal obligations to ensure that risk assessments are being carried out. We saw that very plainly played out when COVID was here. Having a suitable and sufficient risk assessment to make sure that as a business you are appreciating what the relevant risks are to your activities. That doesn't just include physical risk, but also mental health and well-being. Again, I think the majority of us who have been working at home for the last 18 months will know that many employees have been, and employers have suffered or been affected by way of their mental health and well-being. So you've really got to think about how do we not only look after the physical side of things, but the mental, softer side of risk and safety. When we talk about place, again, it's providing a safe environment for people to work in. Is it safe and secure, not just from a health and safety perspective, but also criminal activity, fraud, environmental issues? Some of that may be dealt with by way of technology, but with more technology and moving the risk away from people, you then encounter different risks. So it's how are you assessing the relevant risk when you are dealing with your arrangements that are being put in place. Part of that may be including inspecting the equipment, etc., in a timely fashion, but making sure that you are always thinking about the level of risk involved. Why are we so concerned about all of that? Well, there are a number of reasons why you might be concerned. Loss of business if it goes wrong, loss of ongoing relationships, adverse PR. But more importantly, I think if there are significant breaches of regulation or law in respect of health and safety, then the regulators could come down quite hard. They could investigate, they could prosecute, and also others could sue the business if things go wrong. I could think of things like a failure to risk assess, failure to secure safety, a failure to have adequate policies in place, and a failure to look after the health and safety of employees and non-employees. So all of that has a significant impact on the business, which could result in a fine, or for senior individuals, potentially imprisonment if it goes wrong. I don't want to end on a totally negative note. So the way in which I will end is to suggest that if you're proactive and preventative now about safety, risk and resilience, then re-emergence into the business world will be much easier. And I think the guide certainly gives you a great head start in the right direction.
Kizzy, thank you. And I'm pleased you try to end on a positive rather than a negative.
Always do.
I'd now like to hand over to Emma Shipp, also from Russell-Cooke, who I think is going to talk a little bit about planning and generally practice within the business.
Great, thank you, Bob. Thanks. So I'm a corporate lawyer with Russell-Cooke, as Bob said, and I've got 30 years experience of advising small businesses. And although in some respects the last year to 18 months has torn up the rule book, in other respects it's really demonstrated that some of these principles that we've all been familiar with all our professional lives are actually very important, and they do make a difference, because it's been very interesting to look at the key elements of re-emergence and businesses that have actually followed some of these principles have actually done better throughout the pandemic. They've weathered the storm better than those that perhaps haven't. So it really is a sort of demonstration of how this works in action. And I just want to really focus on 3 areas that I've noticed have been absolutely key in the last year to 18 months in allowing people to re-emerge strong, in some cases, stronger than ever. So the first is planning. And whether this is planning as part of a bigger process, as part of your business recovery process, or actually planning on the hoof as events unfolded, if you have a plan and you stick to it, you're in a much better position come the good times, come the upturn. I was interested in a specific example where I was acting for a supplier of wine to inner city wine bars and restaurants, and of course their income plummeted literally overnight by about 93%. And rather than drowning their sorrows in the contents of their cellar, they got together a number of people into a brainstorming session. They came up with an idea to do home delivery of wine, to do online virtual wine tastings. Now, obviously, this is quite a crowded area, so I'm not suggesting they absolutely broke the mold, but they were able to use their contacts, find a niche in fortified wines. And, you know, it's difficult, it's not easy, but they managed to keep going, turn a profit. They've emerged with another string to their bow. And I think the key things that were really important for them is that they involved people in the planning that meant that they weren't later tripped up by logistics. And they also gave responsibility for the delivery of the plan to somebody who really could push it through. So somebody with the authority to push through the planning. So that was quite instructive. I'd say the second thing that's really important is to have a good grasp of your finances. Bob mentioned profit at the start, and I would say that's absolutely right. You really need to keep an eye on your bottom line. And if the last year has taught us anything, it's that if you don't ask, you don't get. And even expenses and outgoings that people thought were set in stone, people were able to renegotiate. I had a client who was a retailer of and servicing bicycles, and at the beginning of the pandemic, very worried. It was a micro business run by a family. They were very worried that they wouldn't be able to survive. Of course, as it turned out, the world and his wife wanted their bike serviced, so their issue then became getting hold of spare parts. But by the time that became clear, they carried out a root and branch review of all their outgoings, and they'd managed to renegotiate quite successfully with some that they thought they wouldn't be able to. So they were in a really good position by the time the business started to take off again. And I'd say one really key thing, just from putting my absolute lawyer hat on, is you must document. If you do manage to vary a contract, you must document it. The number of times when there has been misapprehension about what's actually been agreed is quite substantial. So please do document any variations that you manage to agree. The final thing I would say, which is really important and really does distinguish resilient businesses, is that they know who they are and what they're selling. And as a result, their marketing is joined up. A lot of management time is spent in how do we increase our customer base in a cost-effective way. And this really is something that for a resilient business is absolutely crucial to know where you're going. Something that's really simple that I notice with resilient businesses is that they do point all their staff in the same direction. So they might have introduced some sort of profit sharing arrangement, or perhaps a more sophisticated share option scheme, so that everybody is interested in what the business is doing. Everybody is interested in the success of the business. They all share in this. Obviously, the most famous example is John Lewis, where all the staff have a share in the business. But the bigger you get, the harder it is to give everybody a sense of purpose and a sense of pulling in the same direction. For these small businesses, for micro businesses, it is easier to have that sense of we're all in this together, and that can be so important. There's a very famous story, you probably heard this before. I think it was Bill Clinton who went to visit NASA, and he asked somebody who was sweeping the floors, who was a cleaner, he said, "What's your job here? You know, describe your job to me." And this guy said, I put rockets into space, because he was so aligned with what NASA wanted to achieve that that's what he felt he was doing by sweeping the floors, was putting rockets into space. So I think that's the sort of spirit you want to engender with your people, and you can use incentivization and share option schemes as part of that. So there's plenty of other really good advice in this guide. I would really recommend you take a look at it. It's very practical and helpful. So I will pass back to Bob now for a panel discussion.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. And perhaps I can start off with sort of a question for the panel as a whole. And that very much is, why bother to look at this at all? Why bother to look at resilience, particularly if you're a micro business? Why start with it? Why bother? Just carry on. I've got everything in my head. I know how it all works. So what do I need to do a plan for or anything like that? Who wants to have a stab at answering that? Matt, do you want to have a first go at that?
It's a good question, and I think if you ask your average business, there will be an element of, I just let me deal with my own problems I've got at the moment. I just want to get through this. I want to pay my staff. I want to pay so they, I can pay my mortgage. I want them to be able to pay their mortgage. There is an element of that in a small business, but the imperative is there in terms of you only need to look particularly at mainstream media, what is happening, particularly in terms of climate change, what has impacted, particularly around COVID. These global issues and issues right in front of them they're not macro. These are very much micro issues that are affecting businesses' bottom line. And I think we have to start getting into the psyche of small business, that if you don't invest in this time and energy, you're going to fall behind your competitors they're the ones who are investing in cyber software. They're the ones who are investing in new green technologies and getting, employees, attracting, younger employees because they're more, aligned with the climate crisis. And it's all of these things. I think we need to, make it an imperative that small businesses get behind. It's not easy. It's much easier in a medium, large business, but it's not to say for the want of trying. And there has to be more finesse messages to get that across for small businesses.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I totally agree with that, and I'd also say there's probably two lines that I would follow if I was advising a small business on that very question. One, the easiest answer is it's the right thing to do. If you want to progress as a business and you still want to stay relevant and be successful in the line of adversity, then you actually have no choice but to be more resilient and to invest and focus on your people and your places and your profits and all of that for it to work. From a lawyer's point of view, very much the regulators focus on the smaller outfits because they have less resource. And the very thing that you said, Bob, why should I do it? I've been getting along fine so far. Lots of small businesses do think like that, and the regulators are alive to that. So what they do is they do focus their investigations very much on small businesses, and they will come to your offices, they'll come to your sites, they'll come and speak to your people, who are more likely to say, well, actually, we don't have any of this in place, or I've complained about something and it's not been thought about or responded to. So actually, the consequences for not doing this sort of stuff and understanding your legal obligations, your moral obligations, and the benefit to the people that you work with, who work for you, and that you work together with, are dire. Because if you get it wrong, then the financial penalties themselves are pretty significant, enough to perhaps put the smaller businesses out of business.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I would add, Bob, what you said at the beginning, it's all in my head. Why should I bother? That's all well and good for the good times, but it really doesn't work when things are not so good. And you have to have your plan in place. As Kizzy says, you have to have all your ducks in a row, because the last thing you want is for more things to start coming out of the woodwork at that stage when you're really struggling.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would concur with all of that, and certainly endorse the need for doing it. And I can't remember the figures accurately, but surveys have indicated always that businesses that don't have built-in resilience through some sort of disaster continuity plan, whatever you might want to call it, which is inevitably should come out of a resilience plan, don't survive far greater than those who do have such plans. So I mean, I think it's important there. If you were looking at it and saying someone was in the state of having not had any consideration for resilience in terms of structure first, and they had limited resource in terms of management, which do you think would be the most important place to start for them? I don't know whether, Emma, you want to have a go at
Sure.
looking at that.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the place to start is really with the plan. As I said before, if you don't have an idea where you're going, if you're not planning for the future and planning for the downtime as well as the good times, then really you're just reacting to events as they happen. And if you've got limited management bandwidth, which small businesses do, you simply cannot just keep reacting to events as they happen. You do need to sit down, plan for the future. So I would say that for me would be absolutely key for a small business.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything?
I say planning is definitely important. I'd probably equate people to that as well, because your people are your business. The law demonstrates that. So I'd say invest in your people, engage with your people, make sure they have the right training and information that they need in order to perform for themselves, but also to perform for the business. And I think that will be one of the biggest pushes, as well as having a good plan in place to ensure success and re-emergence.
If one gets to the stage that there is some sort of crisis, and you take out your plan, and you've looked at what you said you were going to do and how you hope to be resilient, and it's not quite good enough because what happened you haven't thought about, possibly even a pandemic. Certainly I think that would have been the case before COVID-19 for many small businesses. What sense of analysis do you think you need to ask yourself if you're in that position to say, right, I now have a crisis. I didn't provide for it first. What are the first steps of crisis management? I hear silence there. Jump in. Only because I think what is important, and perhaps one needs to build into actually looking at resilience itself, is how you would then deal with that. And what is your crisis management plan? And I think that the businesses I've seen in that case have had a number of things in terms of a continuity plan, but it perhaps hasn't delved when something happens that isn't in the plan. And it comes back, I think, to ensuring that you have a team available of people who can address that, and how one wants to try and find that.
I would agree with that. I was going to say, it sounds trite, but you need to plan to plan. So your plan needs to include what happens if the unexpected happens. Who are the people that you really have to speak to, and in what order, and who do you need to get together? As Kizzy says, people are absolutely key in good times and when there's a crisis. And it really is down to who do you need to have in the room to decide what are the next steps. And it's about communicating. I think the one thing you notice about firms that really do well is that they're really good at communicating with their people. So they come up with their plan, and then everybody knows what they're doing. So people are not running around like headless chickens.
Yeah.
It's very similar to the term that I think I mentioned when I was doing my little summary, which is about risk assessment. And it sounds so simple. I mean, I think most people think they know what a good risk assessment looks like. But when the authorities talk about risk assessments, they do that because they know that most businesses should have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And you should make that dynamic and responsive and adaptable to changes in your work activities or changes in your environment. I think it's exactly the same thing with disaster recovery, because you won't think of absolutely everything. With the best will in the world, I don't think I've ever seen the most perfect risk assessment. I haven't seen the most perfect disaster recovery plan, because it just doesn't exist and it's not realistic. But what the authorities would like to see is that you've used all reasonable endeavours to anticipate what could happen. and what you'd like to put in place. And if you've missed something, you won't be penalized for that. But what they want to know is that you're actually being responsive and adaptable. So you're seeing, actually, we've missed something. What do we do now to change that and to address and to mitigate the impact from these things that have happened that we haven't anticipated? From an authority's perspective, that's what they would want to see. I think as a business, in business, that's what you'd want to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring out a good point there about actually the meeting of what's best for business happens actually to be the right thing to do from a regulatory point of view as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and one hopes that most regulations would be like that. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily always the case. That's a different discussion. Perhaps I can just pick up some of the questions that have been asked on the chat. And start, if I may, for you, Matt, which is a bit of consideration as how do we incentivize micro business to develop greater resilience, whether it's through insurance savings, tax reductions, or anything else?
Yeah, I mean, just to quickly make the point of the last point, in terms of community is critical for small businesses. It's a very isolating experience. I mean, when you are a sole trader, or if you are working from home, if you've only got a couple of staff. And I think having that local community of businesses in the area that you've built up so that you can share best practice or have someone to lean on if things don't go well is so important at that first juncture. You're going to speak to your accountant quickly, but mainly it's the networks you built up, the community, someone who you can just shoulder the burden with will be extremely important. In terms of, you know, what can be provided, I think that those are good examples in terms of tax reductions. I mean, you've got the perverse situation whereby if you say put CCTV or stuff in your business, you can see your rates bill go higher, for instance. That's not an incentive to look at ways to future-proof your business. You need to think of ways that are going to help you and drive you into making a change in your business. So, things like, tax incentives for scrapping an older vehicle, for scrapping an old boiler, for instance, that's, again, going in the right direction and taking you on that journey. But likewise, the tax system has to support businesses, and it's the carrot approach. It's always going to be a carrot approach to bring small businesses along on this agenda. That is the only way you're going to get these hordes of small businesses to take up the agenda. And that's where, local business improvement districts need to understand that point. It's where, local enterprise partnerships have to understand that's where money should be focused if they're looking to roll out cash in those areas. If you're going to take businesses on this agenda, it has to be, front of center in the thinking particularly at a local level, but at a community-based level as well.
Thank you, Matt. I'm not sure whether Kizzy or Emma want to take this question. How does the panel see the protect duty and the onus on owners and operators to publicly accessible locations impact on SME businesses?
Cool.
Kizzy, are you up to answer this?
Let's see. The onus on owners and operators to publicly accessible locations. I mean, I guess there are cost implications for that. In terms of the protect part of as being one of the pillars, it isn't the only pillar. So it isn't going to be of prime importance that you have the most publicly accessible, but you do have to think about who are you operating for? What's your business for? Is that something of prime importance to your customer base? It doesn't really matter how big you are as a business. Who are you catering for? I think is the main thing. And if it's important for you to be in an accessible location or a prime location, weigh up the difference between the cost and the benefit from that. I mean, that's what we do generally in regulation. It's really about cost benefit analysis. And if you think it's going to benefit your business and it's going to benefit the people that you are catering for, then consider that, both from a protect perspective, but also a provision of services perspective.
Fine, thank you. Emma or Kizzy, do you know how we compare with other countries in respect of this, with SMEs in other countries?
That's quite a broad question. I mean, obviously, it sort of depends on the country you're talking about. If you're looking at Europe, then I think there are some very common themes that would come out if you talk to small and micro businesses in most European countries. You know, they've obviously been suffering with similar issues, and would probably find that the guide's pillars are very much applicable to them. And I think that certainly throughout the European community, the obligation and the impetus to plan and etc. is very present. I think in other countries, in the States, etc., it's hard to say what could be going on there and what people could be facing there. Regulation, obviously, throughout Europe. Some countries in Europe are more highly regulated than us, some less, but it's quite similar. Whereas in the States, I think there's a different level of regulation there, in some respects less regulated at a certain size. So I think there could be other things going on there. Not that I'm suggesting it's particularly easier. So I think it depends what country you're looking at, but certainly throughout Europe, I think this would be a very relevant guide.
All right.
In the UK, I mean, I'd add to what Emma says. In the UK, we are heralded as kind of being one of the best in terms of regulation and monitoring of progress for businesses, which is a good thing. What's good about the way in which we're regulated and our laws and our approved codes of practice and guidance is that it's flexible enough to adapt to the different types of businesses that we have in the UK. As Emma said, in America it's slightly different. They're much more strict liability, so you're in a slightly different box. And I think that's to be celebrated in the UK, certainly, because it's really good for businesses in general that we're so flexible and adaptable.
Yeah.
Fine, thank you. Just people have become a little bit negative, having suffered 18 months of COVID and lockdown and shutting of businesses, working from home. And how do businesses need to caution themselves to be prepared for perhaps another plan B or whatever it is, if we don't get through the winter okay and things have to be reintroduced, whether it's working from home or anything else? How should businesses plan for that, but not lose sight, as we all say, of going ahead with their business as well? And to what extent should they be planning, particularly if they're, a business that require on footfall through their premises and so on? Where do you think the balance of that should lie for businesses now? Because I think that's a really difficult thing for people to decide.
Yeah, definitely. The one thing I would say is that it is, it obviously has been tough times and there's no getting away from that. But actually, if you look at some statistics, it's for small businesses, the number that have been set up in the last 18 months, the number of transactions, every corporate team dealing with small and medium-sized businesses has been really busy in the last year, 18 months. And it's not insolvencies, it's people doing deals. So I think it is easy to feel, oh my goodness, we're going to have another lockdown, another work from home. It's going to be just a disaster. But actually, business did survive. Not all businesses, sadly, but a lot did survive and came up with a plan B, and it got them through. And I think that that's what I would say. It's getting the balance right between planning for a future that doesn't have the restrictions and where the footfall is there, but with also having in the back of your mind that maybe the situation that was last March that we had at the beginning of this year is going to return for a period of time, and what worked then may well work again for that period.
Fine.
I was going to say, it's also, I mean, use it as a positive. I mean, it's very easy to be sucked into the doom and gloom of a pandemic or whatever else lies around the corner. But many of us have survived. Businesses who were doing one thing prior to the pandemic are doing something else or have adapted their services. Perfect example is we're so used to meeting face to face. Many of us didn't think we'd ever be able to survive video conferences, but 18 months down the line, I can do it. It's not that bad, and we can run businesses virtually. even if we don't want to do that full time. So I think businesses have proved how resilient they have already been. We are, many of us on this panel are here to hopefully point businesses in the right direction if they're not already there in terms of what else they can do to be resilient. But many have shown their resilience by simply being adaptable and being open to the fact that there are other things they could do and offer to their customer base. So I think maybe use the fact that we know what might come, and prepare for that. Just prepare now. We're all in a bit of a lull at the moment. We know that something might come towards the winter, so let's use the time that we've got to engage and discuss and prepare now.
Fine, and that just ties with the questions obviously come in following what we just talked about. Does the guide identify lists of plausible scenarios to plan for? And I think the answer to that is both yes and no. I don't think it provides for specific circumstances, but I think it provides for sufficient resource to be able to question in respect of your own business what's there and what's happening in the outside world. But it doesn't say, is there going to be, have you thought about there being another pandemic as such?
It's food for thought. It's broad brush enough to be applicable to all. I think you could all get something from it. And as you say, it's a good starting point to start those discussions internally so that you can make it applicable to your business.
Yeah.
Another question that's come in is there a particular window of opportunity between a business inception, investment, startup, scale up, and so on, where resilience is perhaps most crucial or even missed? Where might the pillars in the guide land best?
So that is a really interesting question. I would say that my view is if you start at inception, obviously in a smaller way, then you've laid the groundwork, and actually it then becomes second nature. It then becomes easy to build on the pillars. It's much harder at a later stage to introduce these good processes and good ways of doing business if you actually haven't started that way. So I would say from inception, and definitely when you're facing a situation where you want to get investment, the lenders and the investors will want to see that you have been compliant, the sort of things that Kizzy's talking about in terms of the way you treat your staff. That's usually for a small business, often staff is their key asset. They're not going to have big machinery and etc. If you haven't put these processes in place to properly protect your staff and to be compliant, then you're not going to get investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a stage of being prepared for the questions that outside investors might ask. Will drive you towards what you need to do. And hopefully the resilience will be built around that. But I agree, from my point of view, I agree entirely. It's all about people. It's about people in any size business, but in a small business, where there are a handful of people, right, they have to be able to be a team that work together and as much as possible think as a team rather than as individuals working against each other.
I think learned behaviours, has just been mentioned there by Emma, that learned behaviours is so important. So if you can get it right from the outset, that's wonderful. But I think the point about being investment ready or finance readiness it's a good point. But you've got to remember there's a lot of businesses out there who come from different backgrounds and struggle in terms of accessing finance, in terms of getting on procurement contracts, all different things. And I suppose it's kind of it's not always the easiest thing to do to demonstrate, if you're going into a meeting with a big lender or an angel investor, that you're going to get that if you can't present what happens if things go badly wrong. And I think there has to be an element of support to help those businesses maybe from more diverse backgrounds, to help them, because it's a lot of the systems that we're currently talking about make it very easy if you you can work the system, how to put across that point. But I think there are different intricacies for different groups that probably need more support in this area.
Oh, we've lost Bob.
We lost Bob.
I think he hated my answer.
No, he's back.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And that was unfortunate. To all online, Kizzy mentioned earlier that she was having problems with.
I thought it'd be me.
Apologies for that. I don't quite know why it dropped out, but thank you, Matt, for picking that up, and everybody. And perhaps really, I would like just to pick up on very much a general question in the couple of minutes that we have left, as to why we think that the people issues are as important when many businesses are finding it difficult to recruit at this stage. And as they're building businesses, whether it's for production, whether it's in the hospitality sector, and I don't want to go into discussions as to why that might be the case, right, where they're finding it difficult to recruit, how businesses should be able to build in resilience for, if you like, lack of appropriate personnel to hire as they grow. I mean, you know, I could ask the question, it's supposing they want everybody to work, you know, overtime. Can they force people to work overtime? The answer to that is probably depends on their terms and conditions, on their employment contracts. But it's again thinking about how to deal with that as a particular issue over the next period.
Yeah.
I would go back to the people point. So when you want to get any sort of policy or procedure brought in, I mean, people don't like change at the best of times, but I think the best way to incentivize, if for want of a better word, incentivize people to do the things that you'd like them to do, particularly if it's important for the recovery of the business, is to keep them engaged, is to make them feel that they're part of the decision-making process, that they are involved, that they're respected, that they are part of a team. I think, Bob, you spoke about being part of a team. I think that would be the biggest obstacle to overcome. And once you've overcome that obstacle, I think the introduction of certain measures would be that much easier if employees feel that they're part of a business rather than they are simply an employee that's dispensable. I think that's probably the easiest way to get these things over the line.
Fine, thank you. One question's just come in. What does the panel think is the next major incident crisis?
It's been a great discussion, and thank you for discussing so well these issues facing micro businesses, small businesses, as you described. It only really leaves me, on behalf of Resilience First, to say thank you to the chair, particularly for managing the questions so admirably, and to all the speakers, actually, for addressing their respective subjects so well. So thank you on behalf of us all. Please do join us for our next webinar, which is not far off. It's on the 23rd, like next week, when we hold another webinar on lessons learned from the built environment from the Grenfell Tower, which is, again, another issue which we could have discussed, fires. But anyway, that's another time. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and please stay safe. Thank you indeed. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.